Okay. I have concluded I am not going to try to pronounce this next name, but I'm going to spell the first name and then let me be educated. It's okay. Come on up. You know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Tell us who you
Thank
are.
you, Chairman. I'm gonna take off my mask
Yes, you
here.
may, certainly.
Thank you.
Tell us your name.
My name is Pitchia Poi Winichakul,
All right, hold
and
on, Representative Smyre. I want you to say that name. Okay, all right. Now I feel better. No, actually, thank you for being here today, and I do try to get names correct, and when I can't, I ask for forgiveness. I apologize.
that's okay.
And I'm sorry. Tell us who you're with, also.
Absolutely. I'm an attorney testifying on behalf of the NAACP, Legal
Okay.
Defense and Education Fund, LDF, as well as SPLC Action Fund.
Tell me who SPLC Action Fund is.
We're an organization that works across 5 states in the Southeast: Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And I am the Georgia attorney dedicated to voting rights and part of the voting rights legal practice group.
And so you practice here in Georgia.
I do.
Okay, great. In SPLC, what's that acronym stand for? And you may have said it, and I apologize.
It's just with SPLC Action Fund.
The acronym means nothing.
We have another organization that we're affiliated with,
What's that called?
Southern Poverty Law Center.
Southern Poverty Law Center. Okay, I wondered if that's what it was.
Yeah.
Okay, good to have you today, Counselor, and we'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify. LDF and SPLC oppose in the strongest possible terms HB 531. The bill was made only available to the public through social media only a few hours before yesterday's hearing and less than 24 hours before today's hearing. We are deeply concerned that the legislature is considering a bill poised to create unnecessary barriers and burdens on voters that disproportionately impact racial minorities, low-income, elderly, rural, disabled, and student voters. Moreover, the legislature is considering HB 531 without affording the public the opportunity to meaningfully give input and contribute to the legislative process. Under these and other circumstances, HB 531 is likely to violate several federal laws, including the First, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the United States Constitution and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Although we have concerns about several provisions, we focus your attention on Section 8, which relates to the proposed photo identification requirement for absentee voting. We urge you at the very minimum to remove the photo ID requirement in HB 531. First, the purported justifications for photo ID for absentee voting are pretextual. 47 states hold elections with vote-by-mail procedures that do not include a photo ID requirement. Fraud rates are infinitesimally small. The same is true in Georgia. According to multiple statements by Governor Kemp and other statewide officials, there has been no evidence, none, of widespread vote-by-mail fraud in Georgia, and there has never been. These statements and findings underscore why Georgia's vote-by-mail laws and procedures remain safe, secure, and reliable. Equally telling, the motivations behind this bill are suspect because it was introduced immediately after Georgia voters generally, and especially Georgia voters of color, dramatically increased their use of absentee voting in the 2020 general election and January 2021 runoff elections. Simply put, the photo ID requirement is a solution in search of a problem. Second, HB 531's photo ID requirement would impose restrictions on ballot access that would be outright barriers, if not burdensome to many voters. Indeed, the enactment of HB 531 unduly burdens the fundamental right to vote of racial minority, low-income, elderly, rural, disabled, and student voters, all populations who disproportionately face challenges accessing DMV offices, a photocopier, and the ability to pay for photocopies, internet access, or a polling location to vote in person. Third, LDF and SPLC have not been able to identify any analysis conducted by this committee or the Georgia General Assembly that a photo ID requirement will not disproportionately harm voters of color and other voter groups. Before any additional hearing or committee vote, the Georgia General Assembly must study, analyze, and publicly identify the negative human and fiscal impact of HB 531. Fourth, the legislative environment in which HB 531 has been offered calls for the rejection of this bill as it is neither transparent or open. This committee's meeting today also does not appear to be providing any opportunities for public comment or testimony through remote means, including through a call-in or video conference option. It is imperative that you hear from and listen to all community members who desire to provide public testimony, either oral or written, during your committee hearing. For these reasons, we also request that the committee does not vote on HB 531 until at least Monday. Equally important, this committee must post clear guidelines for providing and receiving public input well in advance of any hearing. Fifth, and finally, the photo ID requirement may violate federal law. The facts recited above include the sequence of events, procedural departures from ordinary legislative process, the lack of any neutral justification for proposals, and the timing of the effort to impose this restriction on absentee voting and the disparate impact on Black and other voters of color suggest the photo ID requirement embodied in HB 531 may violate the 14th and 15th Amendments of the United States Constitution, as well as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The photo ID requirements burdening the right to vote without any legitimate state interest may also violate the 1st and 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution. We agree that elections must be safe and secure, but HB 531's photo ID requirement does nothing to enhance election security. Instead, it is a calculated attempt to minimize the participation of voters of color and other voters in the political process following the historical turnout in recent elections. Its enactment would create unnecessary barriers, burdens, and disproportionately impact the voting rights of people of color, the elderly, people with disabilities, low-income people, rural residents, and students. Thank you for your consideration, and I'm happy to answer questions from the committee.
We do have some questions for you, Counselor, so if you would hang on a second. You made several comments in your statement about the requirements for identification in the bill. What is your understanding of what those requirements for identification in the bill are?
My understanding is that in Section 8, in particular, we're looking at Section 8 here, that to apply for an absentee ballot, you'd have to submit your Georgia driver's license number or your state ID number. If a voter did not have a state driver's license or a state ID number, then they'd have to submit a copy, either through electronic delivery or a hard copy of one of the other forms of ID that are provided in Section 21-417C.
Do you have any thought or knowledge of how many people in Georgia that are registered to vote do have one of those things that you mentioned, that being a driver's license number or a state issued ID number?
So I think the issue here is that they're in addition to this extra burden that voters have to submit an ID number or a copy of ID. The issue here is there's no actual basis for needing to require such identification. So of the burdens that the people who don't have any forms of these identification face, that is a heavy burden. There have also been studies that show that if we're examining and looking at those folks who do not have that ID, their turnout levels, unsurprisingly, are much lower. So it does suppress that vote and because of this heavy burden that those voters who do not have those forms of ID face, and that's the critical issue here.
And Counselor, my question was, do you have any idea of how many people in Georgia, percentage-wise, have a driver's license number or a state issued ID number associated with their voting information?
I do not have those statistics at this time, but I'd be happy to provide them to the committee.
I would suggest to you that that number is about 97%. Overwhelmingly amount of Georgians who have that number we're discussing associated with their voter registration.
I'm happy to provide you that information once I have it. I just want to stress again for this committee that even though it's 97%, what we're really looking at here is if we're truly wanting everyone to be able to vote, we want people to be engaged in the democratic process in Georgia, that we want to include everyone, even those 3%, whatever percent it is, who then face an extraordinary burden if they do not have these forms of ID.
So you're familiar with the Help America Vote Act, referred to as HAVA, correct?
Correct.
And you realize that the bill requires HAVA ID if you don't have that 97%, if you're in that small minority of people who don't have that, you realize that we're simply asking for what is already approved and required for in federal law to show your ID to vote. Do you recognize that?
I recognize what you're saying, Chairman, and respectfully, that is part of federal law, that these that there are certain portions of ID requirements. But I think the issue here, and you're proposing this bill, is that you're proposing these requirements when it's not necessary. There is no evidence of voter fraud. There's no evidence of widespread voter fraud. For instance, let's just take this example, if you'll indulge me a little bit.
Sure.
We don't require everyone to hide in a storm shelter every single time it rains. Why don't we do that? Because we're not afraid that everyone's going to get struck by lightning. Lightning strikes, killing people, not a problem. And in fact, voter fraud, you're actually more likely to get struck by lightning than find incidents of voter fraud. Voter fraud is even less of a problem than getting struck by lightning. So if you don't have that problem, there's not really a legitimate basis to require increasing burdens on people in order to access their fundamental right to vote.
What are the odds of getting struck by lightning?
I'm happy to send that to you as well. I'm not a total numbers person, which is why I went to law school and not math school.
But it sounds like you are admitting that there is fraud in elections. You're just saying it's a small amount. Is that correct?
I am saying that there is no evidence of widespread systematic voter fraud.
So the answer would be yes.
The answer to your question of an infinitesimally small number of voter fraud incidents is yes.
Thank you, Counselor.
Thank you.
Chairman Powell.
Thank you. I listened with a lot of interest, and I kind of got lost at the first of it because you continually mentioned about photo ID. But there was nothing in here in this bill about photo ID. It's about using the numbers off of secured pieces of documentation so that in the process of an election, for the integrity of that election, to show that people aren't voting twice or other types of illegal voters. Now, I'm not getting into the part about the, widespread voter fraud. You're correct. It wasn't found. It's just in a lot of people's mind that there was. As a member that's been up here for years, I've always said in my career that if you want to find fraud in any election, you'll come closer to finding it in the absentee process, because people don't have to show up to vote to show an ID to tell who they are. But that was one of the first concern I had. Was I continued to hear you keep repetitiously talking about a photo ID, but there's nothing in this bill about a photo ID. Would you agree to that? That we're talking about an identifying number, something that we can identify who that person is, to be sure that they're only voting once.
Sure. And I understand that the words photo ID do not appear in the language of the bill as it is in its current form. But I just want to stress that a driver's license, if you have it, whether or not you need to record it onto a piece of paper when applying for an absentee ballot, is a photo ID.
But it doesn't appear in here, and that's, you continuously use that term, which is, sending a wrong message out there to people. Second question I have, you're concerned that, that we're not allowing anybody to speak, but if I'm not sure, we're on Zoom. Anybody who wants to testify can Zoom in if they're not here. I see the lady shaking her head no, but is that not correct? Aren't they?
Mr. Chairman, what we're doing is that we do intend to allow witnesses by Zoom. And is I told the members of the committee, if you have a witness you want to appear by Zoom and you let the chairman know, we will make accommodations for that. And so also we told people that if they want to turn in written comments to the committee, we would take them and give them all to the committee. And obviously we're allowing anybody that wants to come to sign up to testify as well. So we're working with all three of those methods, but if there's, and I'll say it again, one of the first things I did, even before I started talking to the Republicans on the committee, I asked all the Democrats on the committee to meet with me in my office, and 3 did, and 1 and I had discussion with the other the next day. And I would say to them again, the same thing I told them at that time: if they have witnesses they want to appear, the chair will work with them to accommodate that, as well I will with all members of the committee.
So in fact, that anyone that wishes to be heard on this matter can be heard and will be heard.
There are
during the
limitations.
process of hearings.
There are limitations with our Zoom, and we have to be, there's something called Zoom bombing that I am told happens, and you have to be careful with who you give the Zoom information out to. And but we're working within those restraints to try to let anybody that wants to come testify or turn in written comments to the committee or come in public.
Last question, going back to your comments on the ID, photo ID, or numerical. Do you have any suggestions about how in the absentee process that we could do an identifier for factual? I mean, I was glad to hear you say that y'all support safe and secure elections like the rest of us do.
Mhm.
So could you tell me how, any ideas that you might have for our benefit of how, if you don't use a number of some sort as an identifier, how could this be achieved so that we know who these people are, that so there's not duplicate voting and such?
Sure. So briefly, I just wanted to comment on the ability to testify remotely, because I understand that you had a previous question about that. And I understand now that the chairman has clarified the procedures for voting, or sorry, procedures for testifying on today's bill remotely. And I just want to stress that I would encourage the committee to make that those guidelines clear and publicly available as soon as possible, since the next hearing, I understand, will be on Monday. As to your question about possible amendments, is what I hear, possible amendments or ideas about how to ensure that absentee ballots are more secure. And your premise of the question, I understand, is that to ensure that elections and voting by absentee requires some form of ID, some form of identification. I just want to, again, emphasize that there is no widespread evidence of voter fraud, which I think we both agree on. And therefore, absentee ballot voting is currently safe and secure and reliable. There are already requirements for when you complete an absentee ballot request form or when you register to vote. And so there's already information that a voter must fill out when they're registering to vote, when they're applying for an absentee ballot. And so I don't think that there needs to be additional identification burdens on voters in order to be able to request and submit an absentee ballot.
So you don't have any other idea of how we can identify the voters to be sure? You know, I understand what you're saying about the registration process, but it's almost like having a driver's license. Everybody in here that drives a car should have a driver's license. But if you don't have that driver's license on your person, or you don't have a number that could be associated to you, well, when you're stopped for a highway infraction, if you tell the trooper or the law enforcement officer, I got a driver's license, well, they got to show there's got to be some kind of identifier to actually show that that person is who they say they are and that they are legitimate in that role. So that's the reason I was asking, since you're opposed to, and we haven't got a picture ID in here, we have the identifying numbers of these documents, but is there any other way that we can, in your mind, of how we can identify that person to show that the person who has applied and is in fact voting is who they're saying they are, so there's no chances of duplication or fraudulent voting?
Again, I would say that the best method is the one that currently works. If it's not broken, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Voting by absentee is safe, reliable, and secure. And so I don't think we need to add additional burdens to voters in order to further secure, super secure, super secure, especially the elections, especially when the right to vote is fundamental under law, under the Constitution of the United States. And so I think that when someone is also receiving an absentee, is applying for an absentee ballot and then receiving an absentee ballot and voting on an absentee ballot, the chances of widespread fraud are and have been proven to basically be none. So I'm not sure, I should rephrase. I do not believe that there needs to be additional ID requirements.
So then you think that the current system that's in place, the exact match, signature match, should be sufficient, even though in this past election we saw numerous problems. The judicial order back in March, that because of the motor voter ID, that people that vote or have registered to vote by DDS when they get a driver's license, that those signatures are digitalized, so that a lot of the boards of elections, they can't make out whether that's an exact ID or not. And under the law that provides for the exact ID, that's the reason we're looking for something a little bit more easier to work with, so that these various boards of elections, when they look at it, that they can actually see, instead of something that's a digitalized signature that doesn't match up, or in the case that we have seniors who have probably registered to vote possibly as much as decades before, that their signatures have changed. But this ID system is something that would be more specific to that person. So I guess my question is, are you saying that we should continue to use a questionable, flawed system with the exact signature in a new modern day, that these signatures aren't matching at all times?
So I believe that you're referencing in that question, you are referencing a court decision that did challenge the exact match and therefore had to change some of the provisions of exact match. And I'm not completely familiar with the case, or have not basically read it in the last week, but I believe that case requires that a absentee ballot cannot be rejected for failure of only for the signature not completely matching what is the signature on file. And so if that is the current, I agree there were problems, but now there's a case that came in and said, we're fixing these problems because there were problems. So the current state is again, we can always be improving the current ability to receive a ballot in the way that we're doing voting, but at least the current system would not increase. The amendment to this bill would require additional requirements for ID that would make it even harder, and the burden would be even higher for voters who are voting by absentee. So I'm not saying that the exact match or non-exact match signature system that we have in place is excellent. What I'm testifying here to is the absentee provision only that is part of this bill. And what I do know is that it would severely increase the burden on voters who are voting by absentee.
One last, and I'm sorry if I don't.
No.
don't
You go
make
ahead.
it sound.
You go ahead.
So I hear what you're saying, and I'm glad that you agree with me that this exact match is kind of an antiquated system. But my concern is that people who vote, who've gone to vote, and they've had problems with the exact match. To me, shouldn't be, we should find a better system so that they're matched up, so that they're not having to vote a provisional or to be turned away. So to me, going to an exact, something a little bit more exact about identifying these folks, that these people would not be disenfranchised or have to vote a provisional ballot because of that, the match. So if they're more matched, something a little bit more accurate, then they'll be able to, this should be more to the tune of people being not disenfranchised to vote.
I'm sorry.
No, you
Were
go
you-
ahead.
I'm heartened to hear that, you know, it seems like we are very much on the same page of trying to make sure to expand the vote as much as possible to ensure that as many people are enfranchised and can access the ballot. I just think we have different ways of thinking about it, particularly here with the absentee ID, photo ID requirement. It appears to me that the burden would just be so significant on voters, especially voters of color who do not have access to this ID or ways to submit copies of a non-Georgia driver's license or state ID. And that is not the solution, especially when there's not a legitimate basis for requiring elections to increase election security in the absentee voting space.
Counselor, you are aware that Democratic sponsored groups sued the state of Georgia trying to make us get rid of our current system of signature verification. You are aware of that, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Madam Speaker Pro Tem Jones.
Am I? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for testifying. Would you agree that the fact that widespread systematic fraud was not presented in a court of law does not necessarily mean there was no fraud in absentee balloting?
Not necessarily.
So you believe that
I-
if it wasn't shown and adjudicated in a court of law, then there was no fraud?
My basis for understanding that there's no widespread evidence of voter fraud does not rely solely on what a court of law has determined. It's based on fact. So it's based on the numerous counts, recounts, risk limiting audits that Georgia has had to go through over the past year and the last couple election cycles. It is based on studies around the country that, just like Georgia, there is no systematic widespread voter fraud. It is not solely based on whether or not a court of law has adjudicated that there has been factually no voter fraud, although a court of law has many times in Georgia, I believe at least over 16 cases filed in the last since the general election, have also found that this is not a basis for any of the lawsuits that were filed here.
Thank you. And I'm referring to absentee balloting specifically, not risk auditing activities that, confirmed with machines or with early voting in which a voter ID was presented, or in-person voting. I'm specifically referring to absentee balloting. What, other than in a court of law in Georgia, what definitive evidence do you have that there was none? None.
I'm sorry. Were you saying?
None. I do mean none.
And again, I'm talking about widespread systematic voter fraud.
Okay.
And I'm happy to send you multiple studies. I shared some longer written testimony with the committee. I'm happy to send that again. That contains some of that information. I'm also happy to send numerous studies that have been peer reviewed. I refer to you to basically the entirety of the Brennan Center for Justice's website, which not only provides statistics and information about how there is no widespread voter fraud and ever has been in the United States, as well as their studies debunking other fraudulent studies about voter fraud.
So in general, it's studies. It isn't activities related to, say, the 2020 or the 2018 elections that specifically proved that there was no fraud.
I think it's all. So you're correct that I'm not aware of any studies from the 2020 elections yet, although we have numerous statements from statewide officials, Governor Kemp, State Secretary of State Raffensperger, Elections Manager Gabe Sterling, Lieutenant Governor Duncan, that there has been no evidence of widespread voter fraud.
And I specifically am referring to, and I believe I referred to, not systematic widespread, but rather just the singular word of fraud.
A singular,
And I don't mean a
in-
singular instance. I just mean
Okay.
not systematic widespread. But that's a high threshold. There's a lot underneath that.
yeah, I think that there, again, I kind of off the hand quipped earlier about lightning strikes, which I know that this is not a special committee on lightning strikes,
Right.
but so I don't want to go too much into that. But incidents of voter fraud, again, are more rare than getting struck by lightning. I think also shark attacks.
Well, I can appreciate your references to lightning strikes and shark attacks. It brings me as a mother of four to the analogy with stranger danger child abduction. We know that there's a very low chance of that, very, very low. But yet when a mother picks her child up and they know who she is, they know who the child is, they know the connection at a daycare center, she has to show a voter ID. When she, there are many activities in American life in which you show, in general, your driver's license, and people don't think twice about it. But it doesn't mean it's a common thing to happen. It just gives the parents a sense of confidence that their child's not being picked up by the wrong person, even though everyone at the daycare center knows who the mother is, who the child is. But there are certain things that sometimes one does simply to give people confidence. But I would also ask, if the chairman is correct that 97% of Georgians have a driver's license or a voter ID card, what is the burden on that 97%? I'm not referring to the 3%, the 97% to write a number down that they have in their back pocket or in their pocketbook.
Absolutely. So I also understand your references to other important aspects of our civic life, our families, our children, where we want to ensure that they are safe. I will also just add the fundamental right to vote is also sacred. And so burdening that vote cuts the other way. And so we want to make sure that we preserve that fundamental right to vote and feel secure as someone who may not have all of the paperwork that a ton of paperwork or access to paperwork to be able to vote. Your question is about the 97%. And as a lawyer and under the case law, I am here, and as a civil rights lawyer, I'm here to talk about those percentages, small percentages of people, which I understand not everyone will want to pay attention to, but I'm here to talk about and testify to support those people who do not have those forms of identification. The burdens, the latest statistic, and I have one statistic, not a math person, from the Brennan Center is that 16.6% of Georgia voters who do not have a Georgia driver's license or state ID live at least 10 miles away from a DMV, a motor vehicle office. And so to get that type of ID would be increasingly burdensome, especially for rural voters. I'm talking about, and I'm here to testify to support and advocate for those people who do not have that ID because we want them to participate in our elections, in our democracy. And that's how we ensure that we have a representative and robust democracy in Georgia.
So I'm just to conclude for whether it's, 84% or 97%, you're not concerned about whether that's a burden. So when we keep talking about the burden on everyone, it's really you're concerned about those who don't have a state ID or a driver's license. Is that accurate?
Yes, and they are the people who are disproportionately voters of color and other historically disenfranchised groups.
And then we could debate later whether it is an undue burden on them, but I just wanted to clarify it's not a burden on the rest of the voters. So I guess it remains to be determined, is it a burden on the remaining ones who do not have those forms of ID?
I am here testifying on the undue burden of those people who are disproportionately impacted by the voter ID law.
Thank you.
Representative Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are you aware about the situation that happened in Cobb County with the 15,000 ballots? Where there was only 2 that came back as an error?
I am not intimately familiar with that, but I have I've read about it in our great news sources.
Yeah, that is what occurred. Further questions, Mr. Chair?
Yes, ma'am.
So I know we're talking about IDs, and I know within this bill on page 20, 498 through 511, they're asking for 4 digits to be placed on the envelope of the outside of the envelope of the absentee ballot. So that's what we're talking about, where the request of the 4 digits. And I guess my question would be for the authors of the bill. What is the purpose of placing this on this bill? Since we're talking about fraud, do we know, or can you share what those fraud numbers are to why there is a purpose for putting your 4 digits now on the envelope?
I would point out to the representative that if you look on line 508, it says the elector's date of birth shall be hidden from view when the envelope is correctly sealed, or the Social Security, last 4 digits of Social Security number, or the driver's license. So there is a language in here to redesign that envelope so that it is protected when it's sent back into the Board of Elections. That's the first thing I would note for you. What I would also note for you, the purpose of that driver's license identification number or the other identification that is referenced there is because we're moving away from the signature verification process that we have in place now, which your party sued us to try to get rid of. We're moving away from that to something that is probably a much better identifier, as has been discussed previously in this hearing.
But Mr. Chairman, for the
Please,
question, I'm
please.
still asking you, not what the party, what they sued you for or whatever. This is the bill that's in front of us now, and I'm still asking the question, do you know of any instances where fraud has occurred to where this is an extra measure?
Do I know of any instances where fraud has occurred to this as an extra measure? I'm trying to understand your question, but I'm not sure I do.
Mr. Chairman, I'm asking you, you're throwing out that there's a purpose for us to have people to add an extra layer for identification. So I'm asking you, in what instance is the purpose of this? Is it because of the lawsuit, or is it because there's fraud that have occurred?
The purpose of all our laws dealing with voting is that we try as best we can to make sure that our voting is secure and that someone's vote cannot be stolen. We do have instances that I have been told of claims where people went to vote and they said, you've already voted. We do have lawsuits which have occurred in this state in the past where people have been found guilty of manipulation of absentee ballots. We do have instances we have heard of vote harvesting, for example, in the area of absentee balloting. But what I would say to you that is our due diligence in this legislature to constantly update our laws to try to protect the sanctity of the vote. The reason people don't rob banks every day is because banks put in place provisions to keep that from happening. The reasons we will not have people steal votes in the state of Georgia is because we pass bills to try to keep that from happening. And that is the purpose of the language that you're referring to now in this bill.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Representative Burnough.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And following up on Representative Alexander, there has not been found the widespread fraud that everyone keeps talking about. But what about the unintended consequence of the fact of identity fraud? When people start putting their numbers there, and we know that Georgia has had problems in the past of keeping things secure. So while we are asking for this, we also put at risk our Georgians